Ah, the 1980s. A decade I technically grew up in, and one that I look back on with really nothing but fond memories. Now, even though I was really young, and I know it wasn't all perfect, it was a time of transition. America was shaking off the gloom of the 1970s and stepping into a new era of optimism. At the start of the decade, we had Atari, and by the end, I'll never forget unwrapping a Nintendo Entertainment System on Christmas morning. We watched President Reagan on TV telling Mr. Gorbachev, "Tear down that wall." We spent weekends at the mall, hanging out in the food court with an Orange Julius in hand. Oh, what I would do to have an original Orange Julius again. And of course, our bedroom walls were plastered with posters of the wild, futuristic dream cars of the era. Machines that just fueled our dreams and made us believe at the time, just to look on that poster, the future was already here. Cars in the 80s weren't just transportation, they were cultural icons. From Miami Vice's Ferrari to Knight Rider, the A-Team van, they weren't just TV props, they were stars in their own right. So today I'm going to go through some of the cars that really defined the decade. I'm sure there's more I could add to this list, but these were just some specific ones that popped out to me that I remember probably having posters of some of these on my wall, and I just wanted to reflect back on what a cool decade the 80s was. Before I get started, I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you for all the great interaction on my other videos, comments, likes, new subscribers. It really means a lot to my little channel. So before we get started, if you haven't yet, please throw me a subscribe, throw me a like, and please leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these cars. And for a small channel like mine, it really helps the algorithm push my videos to other people who may like it. So that would mean a ton to me, and thank you guys so much. I think there just can't be any 80s car list without, of course, mentioning the DeLorean, the DMC-12. For those that don't know the entire history, the DeLorean Motor Company was actually founded in 1975. There's going to be a little bit of a trend with some of the cars that I mentioned because a lot of them started actually in the mid to late 70s, but really reached their peak in the 80s. John DeLorean, a former GM executive, he was best known for creating the Pontiac GTO and kind of kickstarting the muscle car revolution. He had these grandiose visions of branching out on his own, and he wanted to build a futuristic sports car, one that really was safe and durable and unlike anything on the road. Arguably, he did do that, but I don't know if sports car is the right term to call a DeLorean. He set up operations in Northern Ireland, and that was mainly because they had a heavy financial backing from the British government. Production on the DeLorean began in 1981. And despite huge hype around its design and celebrity ownership at the time, the company really struggled almost immediately due to cost overruns, poor exchange rates, and some pretty bad early build quality issues. The car was designed by Giorgetto Di Giorgio of Italia Design. Did I say that right? It was so unique with its brushed stainless steel panels, gull wing doors, and a fiberglass underbody. The chassis was based on a Lotus design with a steel backbone frame, and I think it was very similar to the Lotus Esprit. Really, the big downfall of the DeLorean was the Peugeot Renault Volvo V6. It was rear-mounted, it was 2.85 liters, and only produced 130 horsepower, 153 foot-pounds of torque. It came with a 5-speed manual or a 3-speed automatic. 0 to 60 times were pretty poor, even for the 80s. 8.8 to 10.5 seconds. The price in 1981 was around $25,000 US, and with inflation, that is over $80,000 today for a car that does 0 to 60 in 10.5 seconds with a 3-speed automatic. Yeah, I'll pass. In total, there's about 9,000 DMC-12s produced between 81 and early 83. 81, they produced about 6,700 units, which was the highest year, the first year. The hype was there. 82, only about 1,300. And in 1983, a few hundred cars were assembled from leftover parts after the collapse of the company. They estimate there's about 6,000 DeLoreans still on the road. And there is actually a company that I think bought all the remaining parts and some of the machinery and the the IP of DMC. At one time, they were located in Southwest Florida, and I actually visited their little showroom when they were restoring DeLoreans, and it was pretty cool. I don't think they're in Florida anymore. I think they're now in Texas. If anybody knows, leave a comment. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the pop culture and historical impact of the DeLorean just cannot be denied. Of course, it was immortalized in Back to the Future as a time machine car. Laughingly, could it actually have hit 80 miles an hour? There was a time nobody really wanted these cars. I mean, I shouldn't say that. People always wanted these cars, but they were not really big money. But they have started to go up a little bit. And again, this video today isn't about values or collectability or anything like that. It's just showcasing some of the icons of a really cool era. And you can't talk 80s cars without the DeLorean DMC-12. And speaking of 80s icons, there's the Porsche 928. Personally, I think my favorite Porsche of all time. While it was technically introduced in 1977, it was a big departure from the 911. It was actually meant to replace the 911, and thankfully it didn't fully replace it. But it was a completely different setup. It was a front engine V8 water-cooled Grand Tourer, and it was really meant to compete with other high-end GT cars at the time that were becoming popular from Mercedes and Jaguar. Porsche poured a lot of their, at the time, limited resources into this project, and it even won 1978 European Car of the Year. The only Porsche ever to do so, actually. And despite a lot of praise from critics, traditionalists were really not into the front-engine Porsche. But that started to change, as the 928 became a bit of a status symbol in the 80s. The initial engine from the 70s model was not that impressive. It was a 4.5-liter single overhead cam V8 with like 220 to 240 horsepower, and I think that depended on the US version or the European version. But really, the 80s cars came along with the Porsche 928S and the S4. The S4 being the late 80s model, like 87 to 91, had 320 horsepower, did 0 to 60 in about 5.7 seconds, which wasn't bad at the time by any stretch, and had a top speed of over 165 miles an hour. So it was a Autobahn missile. It was innovative at the time with 50-50 weight distribution due to Porsche's use of a rear-mounted transaxle, which has become pretty common nowadays. Total production numbers were around 61,000 units. The S and S4, which was the 80s model, sold about 31,000 combined, which is the largest amount sold. The early 70s, early 80s models, about 17,000, the 928 base. And then the later 90s model, the lovely 928 GTS, they only sold about 2,800 of those. So that's a very rare car, and I predicted as it has, it would become very collectible, and it is. These cars weren't cheap. Starting in 78, leading into the 80s, they were in the high 20s, which, again, going back to the price of the DeLorean was, touching $80,000, $90,000 in today's money. Pulp culture. This car was famously featured in Risky Business in 1983 with Tom Cruise. And of course, who can forget the Scarface scene when he's in the showroom buying the 928? These cars were overlooked for quite some time, but values are starting to creep up. They're a tricky car to maintain. It has a timing belt that can be catastrophic, so you really have to stay on top of that. I don't know much about parts availability, but that doesn't matter. Like I said, this isn't about ownership and values and all that kind of stuff. But the Porsche 928 stands out as one of the most ambitious experiments Porsche ever really did. And all said and done, it was a success for Porsche. I just don't think we can mention 80s dream cars if we don't mention the Porsche 928. All right, another 80s icon is the Mercedes SL 107 generation. Now, once again, like basically every car I've mentioned so far, the R107 SL actually started in the early 70s, but it ran from 1971 all the way to 1989. It made it the longest running model in Mercedes history. The 80s Mercedes SL was iconic. And when I think of pop culture, there's so many shows and movies of the time when it made a cameo. I think some of the most famous appearances, it was Bobby Ewing's car in Dallas. Can't forget that. And in the movie American Gigolo with Richard Gere, just a beautiful, timeless, classic, elegant Mercedes. I still see them on the road all the time, if that says anything. The US models, we had the 380 SL and the 560 SL. The 380, which ran from 81 to 85, only produced about 150 to 210-ish horsepower. It really depended on the market and the emissions. And I don't know the exact specs on the US car, but it was just a comfortable convertible cruiser. The later 560 SL, which had the 5.6 liter V8, produced 227 horsepower and 287 foot-pounds of torque, which was pretty impressive for the time. I don't think we ever got a 5-speed manual. They were available, I think, in like the German market, but it had a robust 4-speed automatic, which for this type of car was fine. The 560 SL did 0 to 60 in about 7.5 seconds, 137 miles per hour top speed. Again, this was not a quote-unquote sports car. It was a luxury convertible, and it was a status symbol in the 80s. If you had an SL Mercedes, you were a baller. Total production, again, this goes back to the early 70s to 1989. They produced about 237,000 of these things, and roughly 2/3 of all SLs went to North America. The 560 SL, which is the one I remember the most and really quintessential 80s, sold almost 50,000 units in the US. They were not cheap. I mean, a late 80s SL, 560 SL, they were $48,000 to $55,000, which is $140,000 in today's money. But I guess if you price like, a modern AMG coupe or whatever, they're about that kind of money. So I'm going to argue to say the 560 SL, the 107, will last longer too. It was typical 1980s peak Mercedes, if you ask me. It was one of the first convertibles to be designed with advanced crash safety in mind, including crumple zones. The later models had an airbag. Just a really peak Mercedes engineering. I wouldn't necessarily call these collectible because they made and sold so many. And most people that own these cars have really taken good care of them over the years. But they're starting to creep up in value a little bit. In summary, the R107 SL, the later model, the 80s icon, wasn't a sports car, wasn't about lap times or anything. It was the greed is good 80s peak flaunting prestige. It was built at a time when luxury meant build quality of materials, craftsmanship, longevity. Not like today's cars where luxury means how much tech and screens you can throw at something. Definitely a car of its time and definitely an icon. All right, the next 80s icon, another one of my personal favorites. Car that got a lot of hate for a lot of years and is finally starting to be recognized for the really great car and great bargain that it is. And that is the Corvette C4. Debuting in 1984, replacing the very old and tired and dated C3, the Corvette C4 was a complete ground-up revolution for Corvette. This car saved Corvette, and a lot of people don't realize that. It was totally a car of its time. It was a clean sheet with a sharper, wedge-like body, new chassis technology, new engines, which we'll get into in a minute. But remember, we're coming out of the slogged late 70s, early 80s cars, and the late model C3s were dogs. The original 1984 release had the L83 Crossfire injection engine, which gets a lot of hate, 205 horsepower, which doesn't sound like a lot, but they were very torquey motors. A year later in 85, it was replaced by the wonderful L98 engine with about 245 horse. And I don't know, the torque on those was over, I think, 340, 350. It was a very torquey, robust engine. The L98 cars did 0 to 60 in like very low sixes. Sometimes you can get them into the fives. And they were mated with Chevy's vulnerable 4-speed auto, or 84 to 88, you could get the Doug Nash 4+3 manual, which is kind of a quirky transmission, but also kind of cool at the same right. Like if you're doing the 80s thing, the 4+3 Doug Nash is pretty cool. But in 89 onward, they had the ZF 6-speed manual, which the 89 with the 6-speed and an L98, great car. Starting in 84, and it slightly changed in 85. I'm going to tell you a quick story here. It must have been 1989, 88, 89. I was very young, and my parents and some friends of mine went to the Dallas Auto Show, and I got to sit in a C4 Corvette, and I was just ecstatic. I thought it was like sitting in a spaceship. And when I saw that digital dash, my mind was just blown. For years, this digital dash got a lot of hate as we got into the 90s and trends changed, and they had the hybrid analog digital of the later C4 models. But I find it so funny that all these cars now going back to screen digital dashes, and I love this digital dash. I think it's the coolest thing ever. And I think a lot of people that are a little younger like me kind of have a soft spot for them too. It's just so of the time. Again, going back to that, the future is right in front of us, and it was just so cool. Also, notably, it had ABS brakes. It had a drag coefficient of just 0.34. It was a really groundbreaking car for its time. And I stand by this. They're so affordable, and they're great cars. They're great platforms. They're not expensive to maintain. They're pretty darn reliable. And yeah, maybe not by modern standards, but they're pretty quick. It's a fun car. Chevy sold a gazillion of these things. The original year, 1984, and it was kind of a pent-up demand because there was no 83 model. And the first all-new Corvette at a long, long, long time, they sold over 51,000 of these. But again, that's with the Crossfire motor, and I don't know if you really want one of those. 85, it was about 40,000 units, 86, 35, so it trickled down over the years to 89 until it was redesigned with the new interior and the LT1 engines, but that gets into the 90s, so we're not going to touch on those. There was a lot of cool spin-offs in the 80s. There was the Callaway twin turbo cars, which you could actually order through a Chevrolet dealership. Amazing, super cool, super fast, super rare, which led up to the infamous King of the Hill, the ZR1, which was introduced in 1990. I'd mentioned some notable pop culture things, but these cars were in so many films and TV shows at the time, I'd sit here for an hour listing them. C4 is an icon of the 80s, and I get excited every time I see one on the road still. This is the 80s models. They're just so cool. I'd love to own one someday. I mean, they're very affordable, like I said, so maybe that'll happen sooner than later. I think the C4s are just going to go up in popularity. I don't think they're ever going to be super valuable unless it's a rare one like a Callaway or a ZR1 or something like that. I just think the C4 is a great entry point into getting into Corvettes. And if you're a child of the 80s like me, it's got to be on the list. All right, everyone, we're getting to the two King of the Hills of the 80s, in my opinion. My personal favorite, it's got to be a Ferrari Testarossa. Unveiled in the 1984 Paris Motor Show, it replaced the 512 BBI. Sammy Hagar's I Can't Drive 55 video, he had one. How cool is that? But it was the flagship mid-engine sports car named the Testarossa, which means redhead in Italian, a nod to the red painted cam covers on the flat 12 engine. Styled by Pininfarina, of course, Testarossa became one of the most iconic designs of the 80s. I had a poster of one on my wall. Recognizable with its big wide stance and pop-up headlights and the, of course, signature side strakes that fed air to the massive rear-mounted radiators. It was Ferrari's answer to the Lamborghini Countach, but it also became a pop culture symbol, of course, starring in Miami Vice. It later evolved to the 512 TR in 1991, which we're not going to talk about, what an amazing car that is. But the original Testarossa that ran from 84 to 91 had 390 horsepower and 361 foot-pounds of torque. Again, that beautiful 4.9 liter flat 12 V8 mounted mid-rear engine, 5-speed manual with a gated shifter, 0 to 60 in very low 5 seconds, top speed of 180 miles an hour, making it one of the fastest cars of the time. It was very wide. It was 78 inches, which made it wider than most supercars of the era. It was a hefty one, though. It was a big girl. It was about 3,700 pounds, which made it more of a grand tourer than a true sports car, but that seems to be a trend of the 80s. It was all about flamboyant, big, grand tour, fast, powerful, expensive, flashy cars, and this car just epitomizes that. They built about 7,200 units, which in terms of Ferrari, that's quite a few. These cars were not cheap. In 89, they were $181,000, which is almost $500,000 today. But again, they sold over 7,000 of these things. And as I mentioned, of course, it was a star of the show Miami Vice. Sonny Crockett drove a white one. Also featured on arcade games like Outrun, I spent a lot of quarters on Outrun. It was just the glamour child of the 80s. In summary, these cars are just pinnacle 80s Ferrari. It's a time capsule. It's everything the 80s stood for. Opulence, wedge styling, optimism, unforgettable sound, big Italian. It just screams 80s opulence, and I love it. All right, everyone, if you've stuck around this far, thank you again so much for watching and the support. If you like what I'm doing, throw me a like, throw me a subscribe, leave me a comment. It really helps the channel, and I have a lot of cool stuff coming up soon. And now that that is out of the way, the last car on this list, and I think it goes without saying, it's got to be the Lamborghini Countach. Like the other cars on the list, it debuted in the early 70s, actually. Other cars other than the C4, I guess. And it remained in production until 1990, making it one of the most legendary and long-running supercars of its era. Designed by Marcello Gandini, the Countach stunned the world with its wedge-shaped body and sharp lines, the famous Lambo scissor doors, radical design that would influence Lamborghini to this very day. The Countach replaced the much-loved Miura and quickly became the defining poster car of the late 70s and early 80s. Over the entire run of the car, Lamborghini constantly refined this car, adding larger engines, more flared rear arches, wings, body kits, outrageous things that, again, we all think of when we think of Lamborghini, that matched the decade's growing taste of over-the-top extravagance. I won't get into the LP400, the early mid-70s cars, but we'll start with the LP400S, which ran from 78 to 82, so early 80s. It was a 3.9 liter V12 with 350 horsepower. And then the LP500S, which ran from 82 to 85, had a 4.8 liter V12 with 370 horsepower. 85 to 88, you had the 5000, which was a 5.2 liter V12 with 4 valve heads and 455 horsepower. And then you had the sometimes controversial 25th anniversary car, which ran from 1988 to 1990, had the same 5.2 liter V12 with 455 horsepower, and kind of outrageous styling by Pagani, actually. It was a 5-speed manual transmission. Performance, depending on the model, was generally low 5-second, high 4-second 0 to 60s, and a top speed of about 170 to 185, depending on the version, as the aerodynamics of this car were not actually that great, and it limited the top speed. Total production number from 74 to 90 was only about 1,900 units. The LP400S, which was the early 80s model, was about 237. The 500S was 321. The 5000, which was kind of in that 82 to 85 peak 80s excess, sold 676 units. And the 25th anniversary, which ran to 1990, about 650. Price when it was new in the 80s was around 100,000, which with inflation about 250 today, which is significantly less than the Testarossa. It was a pop culture icon. We all remember the posters. I'm sure most of us had them on our walls. It just epitomized 80s wealth, glamour, excess, featured in movies like Cannonball Run, countless magazines. I could go on and on and on. I actually know someone that works for someone that has one of these cars. There may be a day that I might have access to it, and I'd love to do a full video on a Countach. I'm a pretty tall guy, pretty big guy. I don't know if I could actually fit in one, nor would they actually let me drive it, but I'm going to work on that. At the very least, I get to ride in it and get some cool footage, so that might be in the works. In reality, the driving experience of a Countach was raw, and it was brutal. It was totally impractical. It was a cramped cabin, limited visibility, but it was just everything raw and amazing of an 80s supercar. I have to touch on the collectability a little bit because these set for a long time. I mentioned this in another video. You know, they were $60,000, $70,000 for years because the maintenance it can be debilitating, but people finally figured out what an amazing car these were. And now they're $400,000 to $1 million. It's just out of reach for most of us. In summary, the Countach epitomized the 1980s. It was probably the most iconic exotic car ever built. You can't show anyone a Lamborghini Countach, and they're not going to know what it is. It defined what the supercar look was meant to be. The Testarossa was elegant, and while a little hefty for Ferrari at the time, It was like a fine Italian suit. The Countach was just pure shock and awe. Rolling 80s excess. A cultural icon that will always turn heads and epitomized the 1980s. Thank you all once again for watching my video. I really enjoy doing this stuff. Leave me a comment below. Let me know what you thought. One more time, throw me a like and a subscribe. I've got more cool stuff on the way, and I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thanks for watching.